Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I know you use this video to fall asleep. I am here to help you today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Tonight, I'll tell you a tale shrouded in mystery and terror, an experience that will haunt you long after the story ends. Join Mara as she dares to uncover the secrets of Whitehill House, a place cursed by the restless spirits of the past. Relax, listen to the whispers of the wind, and let the darkness consume you as we unravel what happened when curiosity led her to a house that never lets go. The last house on Whitehill Road. There was a place in the small town of Crescent Valley that no one dared to visit. The locals spoke about it only in whispers, and even then, the mention of its name sent shivers down their spines. It was the old house at the end of Whitehill Road. Abandoned for decades, its once pristine white walls were now covered in peeling paint and overgrown vines. But it wasn't the house's disrepair that kept people away. It was the stories. For years, people claimed to hear strange noises coming from the house, low moans, heavy footsteps, and the sound of children laughing in the dead of night. Some said they'd seen shadows moving in the windows, despite no one having lived there for years. Others spoke of a feeling of dread that hung over the house, as if it was alive, watching, waiting for someone to come too close. When Emily moved to Crescent Valley with her family, she quickly learned about the house. The children at school avoided talking to her when she asked about it, but one day, she met a girl named Sarah who was willing to tell her the truth. "Don't go near that house, Emily," Sarah said, her voice low and serious. "It's cursed. No one who's ever gone in has come back the same." Emily laughed nervously. "You don't really believe in all that, do you?" "I do," Sarah replied, her eyes wide with fear. "My grandma used to live in this town. She told me the story before she died." Sarah went on to explain that, years ago, the house had been the home of the Whitehill family. They were wealthy, well-known, and respected in the town. But one cold winter night, they disappeared without a trace. Their servants were found dead, their bodies frozen in strange positions, but the family was never found. The house had stood empty ever since. Despite Sarah's warnings, Emily couldn't shake her curiosity. The house stood at the edge of town, a looming figure in the distance that always seemed to watch her whenever she passed by. One evening, as dusk fell, Emily made up her mind. She would go to the house, just to see for herself. She had to know what was inside. It was colder than usual that evening when Emily walked down Whitehill Road. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the setting sun. The front gate creaked as Emily pushed it open, the rusted hinges protesting with a sound that echoed through the quiet street. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took the first step toward the house, but she told herself it was just the fear of the unknown. The yard was wild with weeds, the grass long and unkempt. As she approached the front door, she noticed a faint, musty smell in the air, a mixture of damp wood and something metallic, like blood. Her steps slowed, but her curiosity pushed her forward. With a trembling hand, Emily reached out and grabbed the brass doorknob. It was cold to the touch, as though it had been waiting for her. She twisted it, and the door creaked open. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. A staircase spiraled up into darkness, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water somewhere deep within the house. She hesitated, then stepped inside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Emily saw strange markings on the walls, symbols and words that looked like they had been scratched into the wood with something sharp. Some of the words seemed to be written in a language she didn't recognize, others in crude, childlike writing that sent a chill down her spine. She moved cautiously through the rooms, her breath coming in shallow gasps. There was something wrong here, something she couldn't explain, but she couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to the Whitehills. In one of the rooms, she found a large portrait of the Whitehill family hanging crookedly on the wall. The figures in the painting were eerily lifelike, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. The man in the portrait, Robert Whitehill, was dressed in a dark suit, his expression cold and stern. His wife, Evelyn, stood beside him, her eyes wide with fear. And then, in the foreground, were the children, 2 boys, their faces pale and hollow, their mouths twisted into strange smiles. Emily's gaze lingered on the children. There was something about their eyes that unsettled her. They seemed too real, too vivid for a painting. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the silence, a loud bang, followed by the sound of footsteps. Emily froze, her blood running cold. She wasn't alone. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of footsteps echoed from the floor above. She stood frozen in place, listening intently, her mind racing. The house had been abandoned for years, there was no logical reason anyone should be up there. Yet, the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking on the second floor. Her fingers tightened around the railing of the staircase as her instinct screamed at her to turn and leave. But the thought of the Whitehill family, of the chilling portrait she had just seen, pushed her forward. She had to know what was happening. Her curiosity had already drawn her too far into this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, Emily slowly began to ascend the creaking stairs. Each step groaned beneath her weight, the sound deafening in the heavy silence of the house. The air grew colder as she neared the top, and the faint, metallic scent that had greeted her earlier grew stronger. At the top of the staircase, she paused, scanning the hallway. The narrow corridor stretched out in both directions, its darkness impenetrable. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The walls, aged and cracked, seemed to close in around her, pressing in with an invisible weight. She took a tentative step forward, then another. Her breath came faster, her pulse racing in her ears. Her hand reached for the wall to steady herself, and she felt a strange vibration beneath her fingertips, like the house was alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. A door at the far end of the hallway caught her eye. It was slightly ajar, as though inviting her to enter. She couldn't explain why, but something about that door drew her in. She moved toward it, each step heavier than the last, her mind screaming at her to leave. But it was too late. As she reached the door, a loud crack echoed from behind her. Emily whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The hallway was empty. Yet, her eyes caught a flicker of movement, something shifting in the shadows, just out of her sight. A whisper, cold and faint, seemed to echo through the air, "Leave, before it's too late." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know if the voice had come from inside her head or if it was real. But the feeling of dread that washed over her was undeniable. Pushing the door open, she stepped into the room. It was a small bedroom, the furniture covered in white sheets, the air thick with dust. But what caught her attention immediately was the small, wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It looked out of place, newer than everything else in the room, almost as though it didn't belong in this decaying house. Her curiosity got the better of her. She approached the chest, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among old yellowed papers and forgotten trinkets, was a book. The cover was dark, almost black, with strange symbols etched into it. The pages were yellowed with age, and the smell of old parchment filled the air as Emily pulled it out. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling the coldness of the leather. There was a strange energy emanating from it, a sense of foreboding that made her hesitate. But then, her eyes flicked to the first page, and the words seemed to leap out at her. It was a journal. The handwriting was erratic, as if written in haste. The first few entries described the Whitehill family's life in the house, happy, prosperous, untouched by the world outside. But then, as she flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became darker. "The house is changing. I feel its breath in the walls. It watches us. We are not alone. Tonight, I heard it again. The voices in the attic. They are whispering my name. They want something. Emily's fingers trembled as she turned the pages faster, the words growing more frantic with each entry. We can't escape it. It's here, in the walls. It has always been here. The children, they are not who they seem. They know what it wants. The final entry was a single, scrawled sentence: they are coming. We will never leave this place. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Emily jumped, dropping the journal onto the floor. The room seemed to darken around her, the temperature dropping rapidly. The walls groaned as though the house itself was coming to life, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the hallways. Suddenly, the whispering voices returned, louder now, swirling around her like a swarm of insects. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was unmistakable. It was no longer a whisper but a commanding tone, filled with malice. Emily spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. Then, she saw them. Two pale figures emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. They were children, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. They were the same children from the portrait downstairs. The same twisted smiles curled on their lips. One of them, a girl with dark hair, stepped forward, her mouth moving as though she were speaking, but no sound came out. The other child, a boy, raised his hand and pointed directly at Emily. The room seemed to close in around her as the figures slowly approached, their movements unnatural, as though they were gliding rather than walking. You should have stayed away. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the children. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. The house itself seemed to be speaking. The children reached out, their hands cold and clammy as they touched her arms. Emily recoiled in horror, but the grip of the children tightened. You'll stay with us now, the girl whispered, her voice a haunting melody. Forever. A sudden jolt of panic surged through Emily. She fought to break free, her nails scraping against the children's icy hands, but it was useless. Their grip tightened, pulling her toward them. The room seemed to spin, the walls bending in on her. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as though the house was trying to swallow her whole. The last thing Emily heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of the children's laughter, cold and hollow. When Emily awoke, the world was still. The air felt thick and heavy, as though something had changed. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, but when she opened her eyes, the children were gone. The room was silent once more. She tried to move but found herself unable to. Her limbs felt heavy, as though she was trapped in place. Panic rose within her as she realized the truth. She was still in the house. Emily's eyes flickered open once more, and she found herself lying on the cold, dusty floor. The room was dark, but she could still make out the faint outline of the furniture that had surrounded her before. Her body felt stiff, as though she had been lying there for hours, maybe even days, but the time seemed to warp in this place, stretching and distorting with every passing second. She tried to sit up, but her limbs refused to obey. It was as if they were weighed down by something far heavier than just fatigue. Her chest tightened with rising panic, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, attempting to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Something was wrong. The stillness of the house felt suffocating, almost unnatural. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but beneath that, there was another odor, something metallic and pungent, like blood. Emily's stomach lurched at the thought. Finally, she managed to push herself upright, her hands shaking as she placed them against the floor. She looked around again, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The room was exactly as it had been when she first entered, silent, cold, and foreboding. Except something was different now. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. The walls, once weathered and cracked, now seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, as though the house was breathing, living, watching her every move. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, the journal. It was still lying on the floor where she had dropped it. But now, its pages were turned, flipped to a new entry. Emily hesitated. The room grew colder still, the air thickening as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to read. With trembling hands, she reached for the journal. It felt heavier than before, almost like a weight that was dragging her down, forcing her to confront whatever lay on those pages. The words on the new page were scrawled in an even more frantic hand. They are not gone. They are in the walls. In the attic. They watch from every corner, waiting. They want me. They want us all. Emily's pulse raced as she read the chilling words. She looked around the room, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, as though the house itself might suddenly reach out and take her. But there was no sound, no movement. Everything was still, except for the faintest of whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. You can't leave. You'll never leave. The voice, a soft and sinister murmur, seemed to come from the very walls. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she shot to her feet, desperately trying to ignore the gnawing dread that had taken hold of her. She turned to the door, but before she could take a step, the house groaned, a deep, guttural sound like something ancient and alive. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and then, she heard it again. The footsteps, the same ones she had heard earlier, now echoing from upstairs. She wasn't alone. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as though the house was speaking directly to her, urging her to stay still, to do nothing. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The door behind her slammed shut, trapping her inside. Frozen in terror, Emily spun around, her pulse hammering in her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could stand the suffocating atmosphere, the suffocating silence that was being suffused by those eerie whispers. She glanced toward the staircase, her eyes locking on the dark, winding path leading to the second floor. Something was waiting up there, something she couldn't understand. The footsteps grew louder as she took a hesitant step forward, compelled by a mixture of fear and the desperate need to know what was happening to her. She had to find the attic. The attic seemed to be the source of everything, the strange sounds, the whispers, the unseen forces pulling at her every step. Taking a deep breath, she began to climb the stairs once more, her feet moving almost without her control. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows deeper, darker, as though the house were drawing in on itself, trying to consume her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she was faced with two doors. One led down the hall, the other to a narrow staircase that spiraled upwards to the attic. The choice was clear. She stepped toward the attic door, her hand trembling as it grasped the cold, brass doorknob. She turned it. The door opened with a creak, revealing a dim, dusty space. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow, the darkness beyond impenetrable. As Emily ascended the stairs, the whispers grew louder. Come closer, they beckoned, coaxing her forward. We've been waiting for you. Reaching the top, she found herself in an attic filled with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and tattered remnants of the past. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the faint smell of rot lingered in the corners. But it wasn't the dust or the smell that caught her attention. It was the figure standing at the far end of the room. The figure was draped in a dark, tattered cloak, its face hidden in shadow. Emily took a step back, her blood running cold. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, turning to face her with a hollow, empty gaze. The figure was neither human nor animal. It was an inhuman shape, its features obscured by darkness, but its presence was all too real. You shouldn't have come, the figure rasped, its voice a dry whisper. It was like 1,000 voices speaking as one, reverberating inside Emily's skull. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The figure began to step forward, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper. Emily could feel herself being pulled toward it, drawn by some terrible, magnetic force she couldn't resist. And then, just as the figure's fingers brushed against her skin, the world tilted. The attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the whispers turned into screams, agonizing, tortured wails that echoed through the very walls of the house. Emily's eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the attic. She was back in the bedroom, lying on the floor. The journal was in her hands again. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps from above, slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight. The whispers in the walls were growing louder, more insistent. But this time, Emily knew. The house was alive. It was feeding on her fear, on her curiosity. It wanted her, and she was trapped. She stood up, the room spinning around her, her legs unsteady beneath her. The house had changed. The walls seemed to close in around her, the space growing smaller with each passing second. The voices returned, louder, angrier. "You'll never leave." And then, something worse happened. She felt the house move. The walls shuddered, the floorboards creaked beneath her. The house was shifting, rearranging itself. The very structure of the building was changing, warping, as though it were alive and breathing with a life of its own. The door to the bedroom opened by itself, and in the doorway stood the same figures, the children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes wide with hunger. They began to approach, their cold hands reaching for her. "Join us," the girl whispered. The boy spoke, his voice an unnatural rasp. "It's too late. The house owns you now." Emily stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how much she tried to run, she couldn't escape. The house was closing in around her. And she knew, with growing terror, that she would never leave. Emily's pulse raced in her ears as the children closed in on her, their cold hands reaching out like claws, their eyes hollow and empty. The room seemed to stretch and contort, the shadows becoming deeper and more oppressive with every passing second. The walls felt as though they were pressing in on her, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. "Please, stop." Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She backed away from the children, her feet stumbling over the dusty floorboards. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. The girl's face twisted into a grotesque smile, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. "You're ours now, Emily," she said, her voice high-pitched and mocking, like the screech of a bat in the dark. "Forever." The boy's eyes glinted with malice, his fingers curling as he took another step toward her. "The house has been waiting. It's hungry, and it has tasted you." A cold chill ran down Emily's spine as she felt the room shift again, the floor beneath her feet trembling with an unseen force. The entire house seemed to be alive, pulsing with dark energy. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the walls themselves were trying to communicate with her, to draw her into their web. She turned to flee, but the door was gone. Where it had been, there was now only a solid wall, an impenetrable barrier of old wood and peeling paint. Desperation clawed at her chest, and her mind raced for any possible way out. But all the exits were sealed, the house trapping her in its embrace. The children were getting closer now, their faces growing more distorted with each step, their forms beginning to blur, as though they were more than just physical beings. They were shadows, figments of something far darker, something that didn't belong in this world. "No, no!" Emily screamed, her voice cracking with fear. But there was no answer, only the relentless advance of the children, their eyes locked on hers as they drew nearer. In her panic, Emily's gaze fell to the journal in her hands. Its pages were now turning by themselves, flipping rapidly as though guided by an unseen hand. She could see the scribbled words on the pages, the frantic, desperate entries that had been written in the journal by the Whitehill family, but now they were different. The words were shifting, forming new sentences, sentences that were not meant to be read by mortal eyes. It is here. The house is hungry, and it takes what it wants. We cannot escape. It is watching us, and we are trapped inside. The children, no, they are not children. They are something else. Something that was here before us. It is coming for us all. It is in the walls, and it is hungry. As Emily read the last entry, she realized with growing horror that the house had not just taken the Whitehill family. It had consumed them. Their spirits were trapped here, trapped within the walls, feeding the insatiable hunger of the house itself. You will join us. The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating through her skull. The children were now only a few feet away, their hands outstretched, their cold fingers grazing her skin. And then, something shifted. A loud crack reverberated through the house, a sound that shook the very foundation beneath her feet. The walls groaned, as though the entire house was straining under some invisible pressure. The shadows in the room flickered, as though alive, twisting and warping in the dim light. It's time. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a chorus of whispers in her mind. It was the house itself speaking to her now, its hunger clear in the suffocating silence. The walls pulsed again, and the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. Before Emily could react, she felt the cold hands of the children close around her arms, their touch sending a shock of icy terror through her body. The world around her seemed to collapse, her vision blurring as the house began to pull her in, to consume her, to swallow her whole. She tried to scream, but her mouth was dry. No sound came. It was as if the house had stolen her voice, as if it had claimed her very soul. And then, nothing. Emily awoke again. This time, the air was different. There was no sound, no movement, only an oppressive stillness that clung to her skin like the dust in the house. She opened her eyes, but there was no light. The room she was in was dark, so dark that she couldn't even see her own hands in front of her face. She reached out, her fingers brushing against something cold and smooth, metallic. The walls were no longer wood but something else, something solid and unforgiving. The silence around her was deafening, as though the house had swallowed all sound, all life. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stood, her legs weak beneath her. She stumbled, her hands groping the dark air, trying to find some point of reference, something to guide her. But there was nothing. Then, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was small at first, a pinprick of brightness in the overwhelming blackness. But it grew, slowly, steadily, until it illuminated the space around her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The walls were now covered in strange markings, symbols she recognized from the journal, the same cryptic runes that had been scratched into the house. They were etched into the metal, glowing faintly with an eerie light, pulsating like a heartbeat. But it wasn't the walls that terrified her. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. A tall, gaunt figure in a dark cloak, its face obscured by shadows. The figure did not move, but Emily could feel its presence, like a cold weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "Welcome," a voice echoed, low and guttural, as though it came from the very walls themselves. "You have finally joined us." Emily's breath caught in her throat, and her knees buckled. She collapsed to the cold, metallic floor, her body trembling with fear. "You are no longer just a visitor," the voice continued. "You are part of the house now. Part of its hunger." The figure stepped forward, its presence looming over her, and Emily realized, with a sickening jolt, that the house had already claimed her. There was no escape. The walls, the children, the whispers, they were all part of it, part of the hunger that had been growing for so long. "We are the house," the voice whispered, its cold fingers brushing Emily's face. "And now, you are ours." Emily could feel the walls closing in again, the darkness growing deeper, more suffocating. The hunger had been passed on to her, and there was no escape. And then, she understood. She was the house now. The next day, the people of Crescent Valley gathered outside the house at the end of White Hill Road. They had heard the stories, the whispers about Emily's disappearance, the strange noises that had started to emanate from the house again, the chilling feeling that something was watching them from the windows. But when they went to the house, when they stood in front of the old, decaying building, there was nothing. No sign of Emily, no sign of anything at all. The house stood still, waiting. But the people could feel it. It was hungry. The house stood in silent defiance, its windows black as empty voids, its walls cracked and weathered by the centuries. Yet, to those who dared approach it, there was an unmistakable sense that it was watching, alive, aware of their every move. The people of Crescent Valley gathered around it, murmurs of unease and dread spreading through the crowd. Some of the older residents, those who had lived in the valley for decades, whispered that the house had always been cursed. They spoke of the White Hill family with hushed tones, recounting tales of madness, strange disappearances, and dark whispers that had followed the house's every tenant. Yet, this was different. This time, it wasn't just the stories. It was the palpable sense of unease that gripped the valley, a feeling that something had changed. Something was waiting. The air was thick with the sensation of being watched, and every creak, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it an invisible weight, as if the house itself was listening, calculating its next move. Among the crowd stood a man named Andrew Harper, a historian who had spent years researching the strange occurrences surrounding White Hill House. He had heard the stories, studied the old records, and felt the terror that seemed to emanate from the house, but even he couldn't fully explain it. He had never imagined that one day he would be standing before it, consumed by an overwhelming desire to uncover its secrets, even if it meant facing the darkness within. Andrew stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers of the crowd faded as he crossed the threshold of the property, the gate creaking eerily behind him. His eyes were drawn upward to the house's looming presence, and for a moment, it seemed to stretch toward him, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the pale sky. He had no idea what had happened to Emily. The last anyone had heard, she had entered the house with a camera and a journal to document her findings, and she never came back. But now, Andrew knew, he had to find her. There was something terrible at play here, and it was alive. Andrew walked slowly toward the house, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the thickening silence. The door loomed ahead, ajar as though inviting him inside. He could feel the pull of the house, an almost magnetic force urging him forward. As he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. It was colder, denser, filled with the unmistakable stench of decay. The house was stale, but there was something else beneath the smell, a faint, almost metallic scent, like blood that had dried long ago. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he crossed the threshold, and the silence that greeted him was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, their cracked surfaces murmuring with echoes of the past. He glanced around, the shadows in the corners of the room twisting as if they were alive, watching him. Andrew pulled his coat tighter around his body, feeling the weight of the place settle over him like a heavy blanket. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, but his curiosity, his obsession with uncovering the truth, kept him moving forward. He moved toward the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath his feet. The footsteps above him were faint at first, distant, barely audible. But as he climbed, the sound grew louder, more distinct, as if someone, or something, was walking just above him. The hair on the back of Andrew's neck stood on end. His breath hitched, but he pressed on. He had to know what was upstairs. He had to know where Emily had gone. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in a long hallway. The air was thick with dust and the weight of forgotten years. Doors lined the walls, each one seemingly closed to him, but one caught his attention, an attic door, slightly ajar, leading upward into an even darker, more oppressive space. As Andrew approached the door, a voice, barely a whisper, called out to him from behind. "Don't go up there." He froze, his heart racing. The voice was soft, almost like a sigh, but there was no mistaking it. It came from the shadows, from a corner where no one stood. She went up there. It took her. It will take you, too. Andrew's breath caught in his throat as he turned, expecting to see someone behind him, but there was no one. The hallway was empty, save for the dust that floated in the stale air. He was alone, or so it seemed. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "It's hungry." Andrew's pulse raced as his eyes darted to the attic door. The house was alive, just as Emily had written in her journal. It had taken her. And it was still hungry. He knew what he had to do. He had to go up there. The attic door opened with a low, agonized creak, and Andrew stepped into the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dampness, old wood, and decay. He fumbled for a flashlight in his pocket and turned it on, the beam of light slicing through the thick shadows. The attic was vast, filled with forgotten relics of the past, old furniture, broken trunks, and piles of dusty clothes. But it wasn't the objects that caught Andrew's attention. It was the feeling of being watched. The feeling that something, someone, was waiting in the corners, hiding just out of view. As his flashlight swept across the room, he saw it. At the far end, in the deepest corner, stood a figure. It was shrouded in darkness, its form indistinct, its outline blurred and shifting. Andrew's heart stopped. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on broken strings. Its face remained obscured, but the sound of breathing, ragged, labored, echoed in the silent room. "You shouldn't have come," a voice rasped, its words distorted, as if they were being pulled from the depths of a void. Andrew's throat went dry. He wanted to turn and flee, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the figure in the corner. The shadows around the figure seemed to grow, expanding, consuming the room. The darkness wrapped around Andrew like a suffocating cloak, filling his lungs with the heavy weight of dread. The figure moved again, its outline becoming clearer. It was a woman, or at least, it had been. Her body was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Her eyes were wide and hollow, empty of life. Her mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "You're next," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Andrew tried to scream, but no sound came out. The house was alive, and it was feeding on his fear, on his terror. Before he could move, the walls seemed to close in on him. The attic door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping him inside. The shadows reached for him, pulling him toward the figure. He fought, but his strength was failing. His limbs felt heavy, his body growing numb as the darkness swallowed him whole. And then, as if from a great distance, he heard the voice again. "It's time to join us." Back in Crescent Valley, the people gathered outside the house, their whispers growing more frantic as they waited for Andrew to return. Hours passed, and still, there was no sign of him. No sound from inside. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the house, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. It was as though the very land around the house was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. And then, just as the darkness began to settle over the valley, the door of Whitehill House creaked open. The figure that emerged was not Andrew. It was something else entirely. The eyes of the crowd widened in terror as the figure, cloaked in shadow, moved toward them with unnatural grace. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. The house had claimed another soul. And as the figure stepped into the night, the whispers in the valley grew louder. "It has taken them all." And the hunger, it was still growing. The people of Crescent Valley stood frozen in the fading light, their eyes wide with disbelief as the figure emerged from Whitehill House. Its form was cloaked in darkness, its movements unnervingly fluid, as though it was more shadow than substance. The air around it seemed to bend and warp, rippling like a mirage. Those who had gathered on the outskirts of the property recoiled, unable to tear their gaze away. The figure moved slowly but deliberately, its face still hidden in the folds of its cloak. The chilling silence that followed its arrival was broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind, carrying with it a faint, unnatural hum, like a whisper from another world. Who is that?" A voice from the crowd trembled, but no one had an answer. The figure stopped at the edge of the property, its presence like an anchor, drawing everyone's attention. It turned toward them, and for the briefest moment, the veil of shadow around its face shifted, revealing nothing but a hollow, black void where eyes should have been. The darkness seemed to ripple and stretch, reaching toward the onlookers as if to swallow them whole. A collective gasp of terror filled the air. It's not human," someone cried, backing away, but their legs failed them. One by one, people began to stumble backward, tripping over each other in their haste to flee. But it was too late. Before they could reach safety, the air seemed to tighten, as though the entire valley had been squeezed into a singular point. The sky above them darkened, clouds swirling into unnatural shapes, churning as if caught in some cosmic storm. The house, White Hill House, seemed to groan, its walls bending and creaking with the sound of ancient wood straining under the weight of some unseen force. The figure lifted its hand. It was a simple gesture, yet the effect was immediate and devastating. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew colder. A wave of suffocating dread washed over the crowd, the atmosphere thick with the stench of decay, as if the very earth itself had been corrupted. "Run!" someone screamed, but there was no time. The darkness erupted from the house, sweeping over them like a tidal wave of shadows, and the ground split open with a deep, resonant crack. The last thing the people of Crescent Valley saw were their own screams, muffled by the blackness that enveloped them, swallowing them into the abyss. When the sun rose the next day, Crescent Valley was eerily silent. The house at the end of White Hill Road stood alone, its windows now shattered, but still, it emanated an unsettling presence. The land around it was empty, no signs of the people who had gathered there the night before. The earth, too, seemed barren, as if it had been drained of life. The only sounds were the wind that whispered through the trees and the distant chirping of birds, but even their songs had a hollow quality to them. As if they, too, were aware of the emptiness that had consumed the valley. Andrew Harper, along with the others, had vanished. No one knew where they had gone. No one knew what had happened. Some said that the valley itself had been cursed. That the house was a living thing, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter. And that once you were taken, there was no return. The local authorities had arrived later that morning, after reports from nearby towns about the strange disappearance of the group. They found the property abandoned, no trace of life, but the house itself seemed to pulse with an eerie, malevolent energy. Investigators had ventured inside, but none had returned. The valley was eventually abandoned by all who had known it. No one dared live near White Hill House again. Over the years, rumors spread that the house still stood, waiting, watching, hungry for the next soul to wander too close. Years passed, and the land around White Hill House was overtaken by nature. The once pristine road leading to it was now overgrown, swallowed by creeping vines and thorny bushes. The house, though decaying, remained standing, its windows dark and empty. Occasionally, travelers would pass by the old property. Some claimed to have seen movement through the cracks in the windows, shadows flitting by too quickly to be real. Others heard faint whispers on the wind, carried from the direction of the house. One night, a young couple, out for a walk in the woods nearby, stumbled upon the house. They had heard the stories, of course, everyone in the surrounding towns had, but they were curious, intrigued by the haunting tales that surrounded the house. With trepidation but excitement, they crossed the threshold of the overgrown gate and stood before the house. The air felt different here, oppressive, heavy with an unseen weight. They hesitated, but only for a moment. The night was still, and the moonlight bathed the house in a cold, silvery glow. The door creaked open on its own, as if welcoming them inside. The couple exchanged a nervous glance, but something in the darkness, something deep within the house, pulled them forward. The darkness inside seemed to beckon them like an old friend. And as they stepped through the threshold, the house shifted, as if it had known they would come. Inside, the walls seemed to whisper their names. And the hunger, it was always hungry. The couple stepped deeper into Whitehill House, the air around them thick with decay. The darkness seemed to pulse, its very essence alive and suffocating. With each step they took, the house seemed to grow more oppressive, the floorboards creaking underfoot like the groans of some ancient beast. The young man, Thomas, nervously adjusted his jacket. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, glancing at his girlfriend, Claire, who was unusually silent, her eyes fixed on the shadows around them. Claire didn't respond immediately. She had heard the whispers, faint but distinct, calling to her from the corners of the house. They weren't words at first, just sounds, like a distant hum, rising and falling with the wind. But as they ventured further into the heart of the house, the hum began to form into something else. It was a voice. "Come closer." It was so soft, so far away, yet it felt like it was coming from the very walls. Claire felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow, but her feet kept moving forward. She tried to shake the feeling of being drawn toward it, but there was something compelling her. Something that made her feel like she had to listen. The hallway they entered was lined with faded wallpaper, peeling and curling at the edges, as though it, too, were slowly being consumed by time. At the end of the hall, there was a door, an old wooden door, cracked down the middle. It beckoned them forward. "Don't open it," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. But Claire was already reaching for the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a jolt of fear through her. And yet, she turned it. The door creaked open, and the darkness inside swallowed them whole. They entered a room that looked like it hadn't been disturbed for years, an attic, filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and cobwebs that hung like delicate lace. But it wasn't the dust or the stillness that made Claire's heart race, it was the feeling. The air was thick with something else. Something unnatural. She turned to Thomas, but he was no longer beside her. The room had become a labyrinth of shadows, and when she looked back toward the door, it was gone. There was no exit. No way out. Claire spun in a circle, her breath quickening as the shadows around her seemed to close in. The whispering voices were louder now, and there were more of them, like 100 hushed voices all speaking at once, mingling with the sounds of something scraping, something dragging. She reached out for the nearest object, a tarnished mirror, hanging crooked on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but it didn't look right. Her own eyes were hollow, like empty sockets, and the shadows in the mirror behind her moved independently, twisting, forming shapes that weren't there in the room with her. Before Claire could react, a cold hand touched her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around. Thomas was standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not real," he whispered, his voice a hoarse croak. "We need to get out. We need to leave now." But Claire didn't listen. She was drawn to something, something beyond the mirror. In the reflection, something dark was stirring. A figure. Not quite human, but human enough to send a wave of ice through her veins. It was watching her. She tried to pull away, but her legs wouldn't move. The shadow grew larger, towering behind her reflection, its features now clear. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch far too wide, as though it were ready to consume her. "Join us," the voice whispered again, but this time, it came from the mirror. Claire screamed and backed away, but the room seemed to twist, the walls bending around her. The reflection in the mirror now showed the house itself, dark, ruined, but alive. Alive in a way that no place should be. Its insatiable hunger pulsed through the air, and the floor beneath her feet began to shake, as though the house was awakening from a long slumber. And then, the shadow reached out of the mirror. Its long, skeletal hand shot forward, gripping Claire's arm with a strength she couldn't fight. "You will feed us," the voice hissed, its breath foul and cold. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing her arm, pulling with all his might. But it was too late. The figure from the mirror was no longer confined to its reflection, it was here, in the room with them, dragging Claire toward the blackened void that seemed to open beneath her feet. "Help me!" Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. As the shadow consumed her, Claire's vision went black. The last thing she felt was the cold grip of the house tightening around her soul, pulling her deeper into its endless hunger. The next morning, the local townspeople who had once lived near Crescent Valley reported hearing faint cries from the direction of Whitehill House. At first, they thought it was just their minds playing tricks on them, but when the cries continued, more persistently, they grew concerned. Curiosity led a small group of locals to return to the valley, eager to understand what had happened. What they found was not the same place they had once known. The valley was empty, as though it had been abandoned long ago, and the house at the end of Whitehill Road was still standing, as imposing and silent as ever. But the feeling that hung in the air was thick with something far worse than just fear. It was as if the land itself had been drained of life. The trees were barren, the earth dry and cracked, and the house loomed like an unholy monument to its own insatiable appetite. The locals ventured closer to the property, but when they reached the front gate, something stopped them. A cold wind stirred, and the door of the house creaked open. A soft, unearthly voice carried on the breeze. "Welcome home." It was a whisper, faint but clear. And for those who dared listen, it held a promise. The house was still hungry. Years passed, but the stories of Whitehill House never faded. In fact, they only grew stronger. New generations of brave, or foolish, souls ventured into the valley, only to vanish without a trace, swallowed by the hunger of the house. It was said that the house never let go of its inhabitants. That once you entered, you were part of it. Part of its endless, voracious need to consume, to feed on the living and the dead alike. And so, the house waited, patiently, eternally, for the next soul to cross its threshold. The hunger would never cease, for it was a hunger that could not be sated, a hunger that had lived long before the first stone was laid, and would endure long after the last human had passed away. The house still stood at the end of Whitehill Road, its windows like dark eyes, watching. Waiting. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, could still be heard on the wind. "Join us. You are ours now." The hunger would never stop. Time had passed, but the terror of Whitehill House remained fresh in the minds of those who had escaped its grasp. The valley around it had been abandoned, its land reclaimed by nature. Yet, the house, standing at the edge of the woods, remained stubbornly intact, its doors ajar, beckoning any who dared approach. The valley was now nothing more than a forgotten tale, whispered around campfires, told to warn curious children or thrill-seekers looking for a taste of adventure. No one dared to live near the house, but some of the bolder souls, driven by the promise of a ghost story worth telling or the lure of untold riches hidden in the ruins, ventured near. One such group of 4 friends, young and naive, had come to Crescent Valley with no knowledge of the house's dark past. They had heard of the cursed land only in passing, drunken stories told around fires by elderly relatives, but none of them had taken it seriously. It was the perfect opportunity for a weekend getaway. The house, they had heard, was a crumbling relic of the past. And as they made their way down the winding road toward the valley, they laughed at the ridiculous stories. They drove into the valley on a chilly autumn afternoon. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette like a dark scar against the fading orange sky. The windows were broken, the structure sagging with age, yet there was something eerily imposing about it. Megan, the leader of the group, grinned as she parked the car at the foot of the long, overgrown driveway. "Alright, gang," she said, turning to her friends. "You ready for the most epic horror story ever?" Her friends, Lucas, Rachel, and Sean, murmured their agreement, their excitement palpable. They didn't believe for a second in the supernatural tales surrounding the house. To them, it was just a creepy old building in need of a good story. They took a few hesitant steps toward the house, feeling the chill of the autumn air settle around them like a blanket of unease. It was quiet, far quieter than the bustling town they had left behind. No animals, no sounds of life, just the soft rustle of dead leaves blowing across the dirt path. As they drew nearer to the house, Megan's voice faltered. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, like a weight on their chests. She glanced up at the house. It seemed larger now. More daunting. "Maybe we should head back," Lucas said, his voice tight. "This place gives me the creeps." Megan shook her head, laughing nervously. "You're such a baby, Lucas. It's just an old house. There's no such thing as ghosts." But even she didn't fully believe her own words. The house stood silent before them, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching. Without another word, they pushed open the rusted gate and made their way toward the front door, which creaked open as if welcoming them inside. As they stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew thick with the scent of old wood, decay, and something fouler, like the earth itself had been tainted. Lucas, already uneasy, wanted to turn back, but Megan insisted they explore the house. The interior was just as they had imagined, dilapidated and covered in a thick layer of dust, with furniture that had long been abandoned. The furniture was old, forgotten. Yet, it felt strangely preserved. As if it had simply been waiting for someone to sit in it again. The hallway was long, dark, and narrow. Faint whispers echoed through the space, though none of the group dared acknowledge them. Their steps were hesitant, yet determined. But when they turned a corner, they saw something that made their blood run cold. In the middle of the hallway stood a mirror, ornate and blackened with age. But unlike the rest of the house, it seemed untouched. The glass was pristine, reflecting the four of them as they stared back. But there was something wrong about it. Their faces looked different. Megan, trying to keep the mood light, joked, "Nice, huh? Looks like we're all a little worse for wear." Rachel laughed nervously, but the others didn't share her amusement. The reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, somehow, distorted. And as they watched, they noticed something. The reflections weren't standing still anymore. The people in the mirror began to move on their own, stepping away from the group and toward the back of the house. The group gasped and stepped back, but the mirror didn't change. The figures within it moved without hesitation. They began to walk further into the house, but their bodies did not turn. Instead, they moved in unnatural ways, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. "What is this? This isn't right," Sean said, his voice cracking with fear. A whisper came from the mirror, though this time it was clearer. It echoed, like the house was speaking through the glass, its voice a low hum. "You shouldn't have come." The group froze. They turned to flee, but before they could, the house around them shifted. The walls groaned as if awakening from a long, deep slumber. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and the doors they had passed through moments ago had vanished. The once quiet whispers in the house grew louder, taking shape, becoming voices that filled the room with commands. "Join us." The shadow that had been lurking in the edges of their vision for so long now grew larger. It stretched across the walls, the ceiling, growing taller and wider until it surrounded them. There was no escape. There was no way out. No. Rachel screamed as something cold wrapped around her wrist, pulling her toward the shadows. She reached out to the others, but it was too late. Her voice was swallowed by the dark. Lucas was next, his body suddenly jerking as if an invisible force had grabbed him. He struggled, but he was pulled toward the heart of the house. Megan and Sean tried to fight, but the darkness was everywhere. The air had thickened, becoming impossible to breathe. With every breath, the house seemed to pull them further into its fold, its hunger insatiable. "You are ours." Their bodies went cold, their limbs numb as the shadows pulled them deeper into the dark, to the heart of Whitehill House, where there was no escape. No return. The house's hunger had been awakened once more. And then, all at once, the house fell silent again. Weeks passed. The valley remained desolate, forgotten by the world. The house at the end of Whitehill Road stood silent, its dark windows watching. No one ventured near. The air around it had become still, unervingly so, and the land surrounding the house seemed to have lost all life, as though the house itself had sucked the very essence from the earth. But the house had not stopped feeding. Inside its decaying walls, the souls of the lost were still present. Not fully gone. Never fully gone. And on quiet nights, when the moon was high in the sky, those who dared to listen could hear faint whispers carried on the wind. "We are still here." The house would wait. It always would. And it would hunger, forever. It had been years since anyone had dared speak of Whitehill House. The town nearby had become a ghost of its former self, nothing more than a few scattered houses and a handful of elderly residents, too afraid to leave, yet too rooted in their lives to move away. The valley was still abandoned, the roads overgrown, and the house at the end of Whitehill Road remained an eerie silhouette in the distance, as though time itself had turned its back on the place. But there were always those who couldn't resist a mystery. Those who couldn't ignore the allure of the unknown. Ben, a curious young man in his late 20s, had heard the rumors from his parents and their friends in the town. He had always been intrigued by the supernatural, haunted houses, and ghost stories. The chilling legends of Whitehill House had been no different. But unlike others, Ben was determined to see it for himself. One evening, he packed a bag and drove the few hours out of town, his heart racing with anticipation. The air was crisp, the sky fading into twilight as he approached the valley. The roads grew narrower as he ventured deeper, the trees bending inward as though guiding him toward the house. When he finally saw it, a chill ran down his spine. Whitehill House was as imposing as the stories had made it seem, standing tall against the sky, its broken windows like dark eyes. The house was surrounded by an unnatural stillness. No sounds of wildlife, no wind, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. Ben's hands trembled as he parked his car at the edge of the overgrown driveway. He grabbed a flashlight, slinging it over his shoulder, and stepped out, taking a deep breath. His excitement was tinged with fear, but that only made the experience more thrilling. He had to know what was inside. He walked toward the house, feeling the weight of its presence as though the land itself was watching him. The gate, which had once been ornate but was now rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, creaked loudly as he pushed it open. His footfalls echoed in the silence as he made his way up the front steps, the door hanging open as though expecting him. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the door further open and stepped inside. As Ben entered, the first thing he noticed was the cold. It was a bitter chill that seemed to sink into his bones, far colder than it should have been for such an old house. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the dusty walls. The house, though decrepit, felt alive in a way that was almost suffocating. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the creaks of the old house. But still, he pressed forward, his curiosity overpowering the unease that gnawed at him. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he made his way through the hall. Dust hung thick in the air, but there were no cobwebs, only the faded remnants of the past. The house had been abandoned for years, yet everything felt still, as though it had been waiting for him. He reached the grand staircase at the center of the house. The banister was splintered, the steps uneven, but the air at the top of the stairs felt thick with something else, something darker. He hesitated, his pulse quickening. But before he could think, a low whisper echoed through the house. "Come. Come to us." Ben froze. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It felt ancient, like it came from deep within the walls, low, guttural hum that seemed to pulse in the air around him. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. "You cannot leave." His breath hitched. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house, shaking the walls with an unnatural vibration. "Join us." The voice was clearer now, the words dripping with malice. Ben's heart raced, and his flashlight flickered again. He spun around, but the house had shifted. The hallway was longer now, the doors on either side had changed, as if the house itself was moving. He took a step back, his mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Then, the shadows began to stretch. They seemed to grow, bending toward him, thickening in the corners of the room. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It moved slowly, but with purpose, its form tall and thin, its face hidden beneath a hood, but Ben could feel its gaze upon him. "You are ours now." The voice came from everywhere, surrounding him, as the figure began to step closer. Ben's legs trembled, and his chest tightened as he turned to run. But no matter where he went, the house would not let him leave. Every door he tried to open was sealed shut. The walls seemed to close in on him, and with every step, the air grew heavier, more suffocating. As the shadows crept closer, the house seemed to come alive. The walls began to pulse, and the floors creaked with every movement. Ben couldn't breathe. His body was frozen, trapped in the house that had devoured countless souls before him. And then, in a horrifying flash, he saw it. The figure in the shadows, its face was now visible, or what remained of it. It was no longer a man. The face was gaunt, hollow, as though it had been stripped of flesh and time itself. Its eyes were deep, black voids, empty and consuming. Ben opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The room around him seemed to collapse inward. His vision blurred as the shadow stretched toward him, and then the world faded into blackness. When Ben awoke, he was no longer in the hallway. He found himself standing in the heart of the house, in a room he had never seen before. It was dark, the air thick and stagnant. The walls were lined with old, rotting furniture, their surfaces stained and covered in dust. But it wasn't the furniture that caught his attention. It was the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, an ornate, ancient piece, its surface reflecting nothing but the inky void. Ben stepped closer, feeling an irresistible pull toward it. As he reached out, his hand trembling, the surface of the mirror rippled. The reflection was no longer his own. There, in the dark depths of the mirror, were the faces of those who had come before him, the souls who had been consumed by Whitehill House, trapped in its endless hunger. Their eyes were wide, pleading, but they couldn't speak. And then, Ben saw it, something far worse than just their faces. The figure from the shadows, the one that had haunted him, stood behind the mirror, its face twisting with a grotesque smile. "You are one of us now," it whispered. "There is no escape. No return." Ben's heart stopped. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just an image. It was a doorway, and the house was pulling him in. The darkness wrapped around him. It consumed him whole. As the sun rose the next morning, the valley was as silent as it had been for years. The air was still, the land untouched. Whitehill House stood as it always had, silent, waiting. And those who had once entered its doors, seeking adventure, seeking answers, were gone. Lost to the hunger that had lived in the house for as long as anyone could remember. Ben was just another name on the list of the house's victims. Another soul swallowed by the insatiable darkness that thrived within its walls. But Whitehill House did not care. It would never stop. It would wait. Years passed, and the whispers about Whitehill House had almost faded completely. The once bustling town had become little more than a memory. Its residents had either moved away or perished from old age, leaving the valley untouched, the cursed house standing as a lonely sentinel in the desolation. But just when it seemed like the house's dark history would finally be forgotten, someone else came, someone who had never heard the stories, never felt the weight of the land's curse. David, a man in his early 30s, was a writer, always looking for the next story. He had heard bits and pieces about White Hill House during his travels, vague rumors from locals too frightened to speak plainly about the place. He didn't believe in ghosts, of course. He was a rational man, a man of science and reason. So when he saw the decrepit house while passing through the valley, curiosity gnawed at him. There was a story there, he was certain of it. A real one. And David wasn't going to let superstition stop him from uncovering it. One overcast afternoon, he drove his old sedan up the winding road leading to White Hill House, the once beautiful valley now shadowed by the dark presence of the decaying structure at the end of the road. He parked in front of the gate, which hung off its hinges, half swallowed by the overgrown weeds that had taken over the driveway. He stepped out of the car, the air feeling heavier with each step he took. There was an unnerving stillness, a weight to the air, but David ignored it. He was here for the truth. He took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of dread in the pit of his stomach. It was only a house, after all. But the closer he got, the more he felt it. An invisible pressure, a force that seemed to emanate from the house itself. As if the land around it was holding its breath, waiting for something. He pushed open the creaking gate and walked up the crooked steps toward the front door. It was wide open, as if the house was inviting him in. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping across the threshold, the door groaning as it swung shut behind him. Inside, everything was as it had been in the stories, dusty, abandoned, and decaying. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the floors creaked beneath his feet. Shadows stretched long across the walls, casting strange shapes in the dim light. The silence felt alive, oppressive, as though the house itself were watching him. David felt an uneasy thrill in his chest. This was it, the heart of the mystery. He could almost hear the whispers of those who had gone before him, their faint echoes stirring within the walls. But he pressed forward, determined to uncover the secrets hidden in the house's dark corners. As he explored, he found signs of past inhabitants, faded photographs in dusty frames, remnants of furniture that seemed frozen in time. Yet it was clear that no one had lived here for decades. The deeper he ventured into the house, the more unsettling it became. The walls seemed to stretch and shift with every step, the rooms twisting as if the house itself were reshaping to keep him from finding its truth. A chill ran through the air, and David shivered, rubbing his arms for warmth. But then he heard it. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave this place. David froze. His heart skipped a beat. He had been so sure that this was all just a product of his imagination, the creaking of an old house playing tricks on him. But now, standing in the center of the dimly lit hall, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He turned, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind him, but the hallway was empty. "You should not be here." The voice was clearer this time, stronger. David's breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. The house was empty. A sudden realization swept over him, the house wasn't empty. Not truly. The air felt colder. He was not alone. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. David's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he fumbled for his flashlight. When the beam finally cut through the blackness, it illuminated something strange, movement in the corner of the room. A figure. Tall, slender, and shrouded in shadow. David took a step back, the light flickering as his pulse raced. The figure didn't move but seemed to stretch, its presence growing, becoming more solid as the shadows around it began to twist and writhe. His hand trembled as he tried to shine the light on it, but the figure was everywhere now, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. And then he heard it. The whispers again, louder now, no longer just voices, but a chorus, 100, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You will join us." David's stomach lurched. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of a broken chair. He hit the floor hard, the flashlight skittering across the room, its light illuminating the ground in frantic circles. The figure moved closer, its form now more distinct. It was a man, or had been once. His face was gaunt, hollowed, and a deep darkness filled the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. David's breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his chest, strangled by the weight of the oppressive silence. "Join us." The words came again, but this time, they felt like an overwhelming force, pulling at his body, at his soul. The shadows in the room seemed to reach out, stretching toward him, wrapping around his limbs, binding him in place. He fought, desperate to break free, but it was no use. The darkness had already claimed him. His final breath came out as a ragged gasp, his eyes widening as he was pulled into the void that surrounded him. His body went cold, his thoughts slipping away, until there was nothing left. The sun rose again the next morning, casting its pale light over the valley. The house stood as it always had, silent, waiting. And David, like all those who had come before him, was gone. His body, consumed by the house, was now a part of its dark collection, forever trapped in the shadows. And so it would continue. White Hill House was not just a building. It was a prison, one that devoured the souls of those who dared enter. It was never empty, never truly abandoned. It waited, patient and insatiable, for the next curious soul to wander too close, to step across the threshold. It would always hunger. Days passed since David's disappearance, and the town near White Hill House continued its slow descent into obscurity. A handful of old-timers who lived at the edge of the town still remembered the stories of the house and its cursed history, but no one spoke of it openly anymore. The house, for all intents and purposes, had been forgotten by the living. But in the quietest corners of the valley, the whispers still linger. It was another year before anyone dared to venture close to White Hill House again. This time, it wasn't a writer or a curious adventurer seeking the truth, it was something else entirely. Something darker. Anna, a woman in her late 20s, had recently moved to the nearby town after her fiancé, David, had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. No one could explain it, not even the police, who claimed that David's car had been found abandoned near the edge of the valley, the doors wide open, but with no sign of struggle. The townspeople, however, had their own theories, but Anna, despite the warnings, needed to know what happened to him. The local townsfolk refused to speak to her when she arrived. They avoided her questions, exchanged nervous glances when she mentioned David's name. The only person who had spoken to her about David was Mrs. Grayson, an elderly woman who lived in a rundown house at the edge of the town. "You're David, dear Mrs. Grayson had said in a hushed voice, her gnarled fingers wringing a thin scarf around her frail neck. He should have known better. He didn't understand what White Hill House really is. None of them do, until it's too late. Anna was resolute. The day after Mrs. Grayson's cryptic words, she found herself driving up the winding path toward the house, the same haunting sensation creeping over her that had been in her dreams for weeks. The day was overcast, and the sky seemed heavy, as if it too shared the dread that had consumed her every waking moment. She parked her car just beyond the rusted gate, the sight of White Hill House sending a sharp chill up her spine. But she didn't hesitate. This was her last chance to understand, to see the place where David had disappeared. The house loomed before her, an ancient structure that seemed to swallow the light, casting an eerie shadow over the valley. She stepped out of the car, a deep, unsettling silence surrounding her. The air felt thick, damp, as though the very earth had absorbed something dark and inescapable. With each step toward the house, Anna's heart pounded harder, but she kept going. She needed answers, even if they would tear her apart. As she crossed the threshold, the door creaked shut behind her. The house greeted her with its suffocating darkness, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. She could almost feel the pulse of the place, like a slow, methodical beating. Anna held her breath as she ventured deeper into the house. Dust coated every surface, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Her flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing signs of a past long forgotten, broken furniture, faded paintings, and torn curtains hanging limply from the windows. But then, she heard it. A soft whisper, almost inaudible. "Anna." She froze. Her pulse quickened. The voice was familiar. She turned toward the sound, but there was no one. The house seemed to hum with life, unnatural life. "Anna, come closer." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice, David's voice, was unmistakable. He was here. She had to find him. She moved forward, her feet dragging her along, as if the house itself were pulling her deeper into its core. The further she ventured, the colder it became. The walls seemed to close in around her, and her breath formed in small clouds in the frigid air. The whisper came again, louder this time, filled with desperation. "I'm here. I'm waiting." Anna's eyes darted around the dimly lit room, looking for the source. She was no longer sure if she was hearing David's voice in her mind or if it was real, but her body moved of its own accord, guided by a force she couldn't explain. It led her up a narrow staircase, the steps creaking underfoot as if protesting her every movement. At the top of the stairs, the air grew thicker, the house pulsing with an eerie energy. The hall stretched before her, endless, as though the house itself had no true dimensions. There was a door at the end, half open, beckoning her forward. The whispers were now a chorus, David's voice blending with others, voices of those who had been lost to the house, drawn to it like moths to a flame. Anna felt a wave of nausea hit her, but she couldn't stop. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched toward the door. And then, in an instant, she was in the room. It was smaller than she had imagined, the air oppressive with the weight of something ancient and evil. The room was empty, save for a large mirror at the far end, its surface covered in grime and dust. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was more deafening than the noise had been. Her pulse raced. She felt something in the air, something sinister. And then she saw it. In the mirror's reflection, she saw herself standing there, just as she was. But there was something else, something behind her. A figure, tall and shadowed, its face obscured by darkness. It was moving, closing in. Anna spun around, but there was no one there. "You've come. For him." The voice was low, a soft growl that seemed to echo in her bones. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its form more defined, its hollow eyes locked onto her own. "He is ours, Anna. You should not have come." The words filled the room, vibrating the air around her. Anna stumbled backward, panic rising in her chest. The room was closing in on her. The figure in the mirror was no longer just an image, it was reaching out, its dark fingers stretching toward her. The house seemed to groan as if it were alive, and Anna's vision began to blur. Her body moved on its own, forced by some unseen power to approach the mirror. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's face was now visible, twisted, decayed, and impossibly hollow. It smiled, a grotesque, mocking grin. "Join us. Forever." With a desperate scream, Anna shoved herself away from the mirror, stumbling back into the room. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. The house rumbled, the walls shaking, as if the very foundation was shifting beneath her feet. The mirror's reflection distorted, the faces of the lost souls swirling within it. Anna turned and ran, but the house had already claimed her. The door to the stairwell slammed shut as she tried to escape. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating, as the voices of those trapped in the house swirled around her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. "You cannot escape," they whispered, the words seeping into her mind, filling her with a cold despair. And as the last remnants of light from her flashlight flickered out, the house consumed her. The town remained as silent as ever, the sun rising and setting over the valley, oblivious to the horrors contained within White Hill House. The house stood there, waiting for its next victim, its insatiable hunger never sated. Anna, like all those before her, was now a part of it, an echo in the dark, lost in the labyrinth of shadows and whispers that never ceased. White Hill House had no end. It was eternal, its curse stretching across time, consuming all who came too close, feeding off the souls of the curious, the brave, and the foolish. And so the cycle continued, with the house ever watchful, always hungry. Months passed since Anna's disappearance. White Hill House, though silent, continued to exude an air of menace, its cursed presence unyielding. But despite the terror that it instilled in the town's people, life moved on, as it always did. The town settled into its slow rhythm, and with time, even Anna's name began to fade from the memories of those who had known her. But in the deepest shadows of White Hill House, the spirits trapped within its walls stirred, waiting for the inevitable. One cold autumn evening, when the fog rolled thick over the valley, a new presence arrived. Mara, a college student in her early 20s, had recently moved to the town to start her internship at the local library. She was curious by nature, always drawn to the mysteries and untold stories that others dismissed as old wives' tales. The locals, with their long-standing fears of White Hill House, had given her only vague warnings when she asked about it. Most of them simply looked away, their voices dropping to a near whisper as they tried to steer her attention to safer topics. Mara was intrigued. She had heard snippets of the house's past, of disappearances, of strange occurrences, but she had never been one to believe in ghosts or curses. No, she was a woman of reason, someone who demanded proof before she would give in to superstition. Her curiosity bloomed when she learned of the house's proximity to her new home. It was right there, at the end of the long, twisted road that she passed every day on her way to the library. And, of course, there were the stories, the ones that whispered of lost souls and forgotten lives. One afternoon, with the sun hanging low in the sky, Mara found herself standing at the entrance of White Hill House. The tall iron gate groaned in protest as she pushed it open, the rusted hinges screeching, and she stepped onto the overgrown path leading up to the door. There was a strange sort of peace to the place, despite its menacing reputation, like a place where time had forgotten to move. Mara's heart quickened, and she paused for a moment, standing at the edge of the threshold. She didn't know why she had come, perhaps it was to finally discover the truth behind the stories, or maybe she had simply felt drawn to it, compelled by something that lay just beneath the surface. The door was ajar, as if inviting her in. Just a quick look, Mara muttered to herself. Just a few minutes. I can handle this. She stepped inside, and as soon as she did, the temperature dropped. The air grew thick and still, heavy with the scent of decay. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light streaming through broken windows, but the silence pressed down on her with an almost tangible weight. Mara's flashlight cut through the darkness as she walked deeper into the house, the beam illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the once grand furniture now overtaken by time and neglect. The place was decaying, but in a way that felt oddly alive, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her steps echoed in the stillness, and she could almost hear the sound of whispers just beyond her hearing. But she pushed the thoughts away. This was just an old house, after all. Nothing more. As she ventured further, she found a staircase that spiraled upward, leading into the unknown. A sudden chill crawled down her spine, and she hesitated. Something about the staircase called to her, a silent beckoning from the dark. Just a few more steps, she told herself, but the hesitation was still there, tugging at the edges of her resolve. Her hand gripped the rail as she ascended the staircase, each creak of the wood beneath her feet louder than the last. And then, at the top, she saw it. The door. It was old, with faded carvings that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. As if the design itself was in motion. Mara felt an uncomfortable pull toward it, like she was being drawn into the very core of the house's mystery. She couldn't resist. The door swung open with a soft groan, revealing a room much smaller than the ones she had already explored. There was a large, dusty mirror on the far wall, its surface tarnished with age. In front of it stood a figure, a shadow, a presence that she could not quite see clearly. "Who's there?" Mara called out, her voice trembling slightly. The room was empty, yet the air seemed to shimmer, alive with an unseen force. And then, in the mirror, she saw herself, but not as she was. Her reflection was pale, eyes hollow and dark. Her face was twisted in anguish, her mouth stretched wide as though she were screaming. But no sound came from the reflection. Mara took a step back, heart racing. Her breath came in short bursts as she fumbled for her flashlight, but it slipped from her grip, crashing to the floor with a loud clatter. The room plunged into darkness. Then came the whispers. "Mara." The voice was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from all directions. "Mara, come closer." Her pulse raced as she backed away, the darkness pressing in. She stumbled over her feet, the walls seeming to close in around her. The temperature dropped further, the chill settling into her bones. "Mara." It was David's voice. It was unmistakable. The room spun around her, and she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house. Her chest tightened, the whispers now a deafening chorus, all of them urging her closer, pulling her toward the mirror. She had to escape. With every ounce of strength, she turned and ran, crashing through the dark hallway, slamming into walls as the house seemed to grow in size, its twisting corridors stretching on endlessly. But the whispers followed her, the sound of feet dragging behind her, chasing her. "Join us." The chorus of voices was relentless. Mara reached the stairs, her feet flying as she ran back down them. The house was alive now, the air thick with malevolent energy. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. With panic bubbling in her chest, Mara turned back toward the hallway. The shadows stretched toward her, reaching with long, twisted fingers. The mirror above the fireplace caught her attention, and she saw herself again, only this time, the reflection was smiling at her, its eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You're part of it now." The words echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her breath quickening as the house closed in around her. And then, silence. The fog rolled thick outside the house, but inside, there was only darkness, empty and still. The next morning, the sun rose over Whitehill House, casting its pale light across the valley once more. No one would find Mara's body, nor any trace of her. As it had with all the others before her, Whitehill House had claimed her. Its hunger was never satisfied. The spirits of the lost remained trapped within the house, their voices now added to the chorus of the damned. Whitehill House endured, its curse continuing, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to wander too close. The house never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. The echoes of the past could still be heard, but they would never be freed. And the house would never be empty again. Years passed, and the town slowly faded into obscurity. The roads to Whitehill House grew more overgrown, and nature began to reclaim the land. People moved away, the few who remained never speaking of the house, as if the very mention of it would bring forth a darkness too terrible to confront. And yet, on nights when the fog thickened in the valley, and the moon hung heavy in the sky, those who dared to wander too close to the old house could still hear it. The whispers. They echoed through the trees and over the hills, like a distant memory that refused to be forgotten. The voices of the lost souls, trapped forever within Whitehill House, never ceased. They whispered of secrets long buried, of the horrors endured, and of the unyielding hunger of the house itself. But no one dared listen. And the house, with its rotting walls and decaying foundation, continued to stand. A monument to the past. To the darkness. To the souls it had consumed. Forever waiting. Forever hungry. For the next to come.